Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Talk at 12 for this semester. My name is Elizabeth Day, and I'm the Associate Director for Policy and Training Initiatives at the BCTR. And we'll have more talks throughout the spring as part of our Pathways to Social Justice series, so please keep an eye out for the schedule. I'd like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga Nation are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Cayuga Nation dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Cayuga Nation people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Also, just a reminder, if you are joining us, as you join us online today, please go ahead and put questions into the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those throughout the talk, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jamein Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is Assistant Professor in the Brooks School of Public Policy, and his research agenda currently consists of 4 broad overarching themes, focusing on the intersectionality of institutional discrimination, access to social justice, crime and criminal justice, and race and economic inequality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cunningham.
Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's talk. I know there's a town hall meeting, which everyone probably would like to be in, especially if you're in the Brooks School right now. So I really appreciate those who decided to attend today's talk. I'm Jamein Cunningham, as I was just introduced. I am presenting my work today on affirmative action litigation and police killings of civilians. This is some work that I've been working on for a while with my colleagues, Robin Cox of USC and Roberto Ortega from Indiana University. And just to kind of introduce myself to the broader Cornell faculty and everyone at BCTR, my research agenda basically focuses on race and public policy in particular. My research agenda basically focus on the intersectionalities of race, crime, and poverty or inequality. And basically, what my research goal is to link public policies from basically the 1960s and 1970s through today to the current economic conditions of Black Americans. So therefore, I have research on the war on poverty, the war on drugs. I also study Black protest movements. In particular, I link the protest movements from the 1960s to the Black Lives Matter social movements to see if it results in any changes in economic outcomes or disparities, especially as it relates to police contact, which is a large part of my research agenda. The current work that I have on racial disparities in police contact focuses on police use of force, which is the main topic of today's talk on affirmative action. So I am an economist who studies racial disparities. I also do it from a historical lens, and I focus on policies from the 1960s. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One, the racial disparities that we see today are historical in nature, right? They did not occur in a vacuum. And so having this historical lens allows me to think deeper about some of the nuances as it relates to how did we get here, and so maybe give a different viewpoint on policies and how certain policies can be implemented or change or contribute to the racial disparities or reduce the racial disparities that we see. Also, I did my PhD at the University of Michigan, and while I was there, I got the opportunity to work with Martha Bailey, who's now at UCLA. But during that time, she was working on the war on poverty, and so basically worked on one of the programs, the legal service program for the war on poverty, and so it centered me in the 1960s. But in general, I've always been interested in the 1960s, and this is a part just due to my childhood. I was raised by my grandmother, who was born in 1929. She had an 8th grade education, and she moved north as part of the second wave of the Great Migration after World War II. And as I guess it's a preteen, an emerging teen, she made me watch this PBS documentary called The Eyes on the Prize. And basically, this documentary just gives you the history of the civil rights movement starting in the late 1950s and ends with the Black Power movement in the late 60s and 1970s. And I watched this over and over again. And then it led me to other documentaries and movies and books, right? And I'm doing all this at 13 and 14. And so when I got to Michigan and started working on the war on poverty, I had like so many questions just related to the things that I was reading as a child. But also, like, now thinking about the 1960s and being in a policy school, a lot of the conversation, especially as it relates to Black Lives Matter and relates to policing, are rooted in the 1960s. So when we think about a qualified immunity, right, that's a 1960 advent. If we think about collective bargaining and police unions, where police officers got the right to bargain, in the 1960s, when other public sector workers got the right to bargain. And so the 1960s provide, right, an interesting way to kind of contextualize some of the conversations, but also provide an environment in which we can examine at least the introduction of some of these policies. And then I also focus on racial disparities in crime and policing. And my work here is mainly due to my own personal interactions with the police, and one interaction in particular. After my first year at Michigan State, I came home unannounced, just to surprise my family. And I went home and no one was there. And so I decided to walk the 3 small blocks to my uncle's house. I am not from a major urban area. I'm from a small town called South Haven in Michigan. It has roughly 7,000 residents. The population triples in the summer to over 20,000 residents. Highly segregated, so it's a small town with a small Black community. If you ever watched the show Dawson's Creek in the late 90s or early 2000s, they reside in this fictional town called Cape Side. And that's basically what South Haven is, this town on Lake Michigan. And so when I go home and I decide to go to my uncle's house, walk these 3 blocks, I see an unmarked van in front of me, basically on the block in front of my uncle's house. And I can't tell what the van is. I just notice it's a van parked on the street. And so once I get basically to the intersection before where the van is parked, I realize it's a police van. And so I could do a couple of things. I could walk straight. I'm on the other side of the street of the van. I can't see who's in the van. The van could be parked there and no one is in the van. Or I could turn right or left and just walk around the block, make my walk longer. And so I look to the left to see if I'm going to walk that way. And I've noticed something new after being gone for a year, right? Drug activity, in which I could see drug trafficking occur, right? And so I made a decision, well, I'm not going to go that way. Mainly because if the police do decide to come and question me and follow me that way, I will get blamed for bringing the police that way, right? I don't even know who's down there. So I decided to walk straight. Maybe nothing would happen. As I approach, get closer to the police van, 6 police officers jump out, guns pointed at me, telling me to get my hands in the air. Stop, get your hands in the air. They come, frisk me. Officer grabs my wallet, takes my ID, walks away. They ask me the questions: who are you? Where are you going? What are you doing? So forth and so on. Answer the questions. And then they started to ask me, do I know certain people? Do I know where certain activities are taking place? And I say, no, I don't know anything. I just got here. Right. And afterwards, I get my ID back. I proceed to walk to 100 meters, 100 feet, probably not even meters, to my uncle's house. I was that close. And I took a couple of things away from that interaction. The first is that at least these police officers, and probably police officers in general, are not great at doing their job, right? They were basically around the corner from where they needed to be. The second part is that these police officers did not have much community, right, rapport, right? In the sense they were situated in a part of the neighborhood where they were elderly, right? So there was a few homes with elderly people and a couple of homes with small children, right? The individuals or the groups of people that you think will, work with the police to keep their community safe, right? But that wasn't the case. Afterwards, there was a big discussion of what happened. The police didn't make any arrests on that day. At least no one knew of any arrests that were made that day. And then the last part, it was all white officers, right? And I don't know if having a Black police officer would have changed the events. It wasn't the first time the police have ever stopped me and held at gunpoint. It wasn't the last time, but it was the only time that the police actually put a gun to my head, right? Pointed a gun at my head while asking me these questions. And so ever since then, I've been interested in policing, proper policing, police intervention, racial disparities, and police contact. And so that led me to a series of questions focusing on police and protest movements in the 1960s as well as today. And today's talk on affirmative action, right? The principal motivating factor for this research, outside of my own experience with the police, has to do with the most recent wave of protests that have been occurring over the past 8 or so years with the Black Lives Matter social movement. A lot of the angst coming from activists has to do with holding the police accountable for excessive use of force, and activists are calling for federal intervention into local policing. Right, the idea is that local politicians are intransigent and more likely to uphold the status quo. Right, but even from a social policy perspective, this is important due to the racial disparities that exist as it relates to police contact and police violence. It's estimated that Black and Indigenous populations experience higher rates of lethal force or police violence relative to other demographic groups. And recent research have linked racial disparities in police violence to protest movements, both historical and more contemporary protests, the adoption of collective bargaining rights, especially as it relates to the duty to bargain provision. This is the provision that basically states that local municipalities have to bargain in good faith if employees are able to establish it. But what's important for at least thinking about the question about affirmative action and affirmative action litigation is the race of the responding officers. There's recent research by Hoekstra and Sloan that shows that white officers are 60% more likely to use violence relative to non-white officers, and twice as likely to use force when responding to service calls in minority communities. But protests surrounding police violence is not a new phenomenon in the Black community. So there's a lot of talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, but police brutality and excessive use of force was a major platform item of the NAACP dating back to the 1930s. The uprisings in Black communities in the 1960s were triggered by claims of excessive use of force by the police. What's different now over at least the last 2 years, at least, is a growing support to abolish the police, right? The idea is that you take, tax dollars and you use them to fund social programs to address the underlying conditions that may contribute to or incentivize criminal behavior. Now, this is an extreme view for individuals on both the left and the right of our political spectrum, but there is a growing agreement that something needs to change as it relates to policing. A recent Gallup poll showed that 58% of Americans, or at least those who participated in the poll, supported police reform, and over 90% of those respondents supported reform that increased police transparency and accountability. Now, historically, federal intervention into local policing has centered on 3 themes, right? The first one is increasing or implementing training as it relates to diversity or dealing with diverse populations. Probably the least or successful of the federal interventions in local policing are those designed to increase transparency and oversight. This is partly due to police culture. This is also due to police unions, but also due to state statutes that also provide additional benefits and protections to police officers. And then lastly, probably the most successfully implemented federal intervention into local policing has been those reforms that targeted increasing minorities or underrepresented populations in local police departments. Right, and the federal government has been calling for more diversity in policing in police dating back to the 1960s. The idea was that you diversify the police department and you improve police community interactions and possibly increase police productivity and reduce crime. The Kerner Commission, which was established after the protests or uprisings in Detroit and Newark in 1967, was formed by or put together by President Johnson to diagnose the underlying factors that led to those events, but also prescribe policy recommendations to reduce the likelihood of future violent demonstrations. That document explicitly called for diversifying the police department. And following the Kerner Commission, the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals call for every local municipal police department to address the needs of their minority population. And they explicitly call for affirmative action in hiring to achieve proportional representation in the police department, basically establishing the benchmark that the police department should demographically mirror the communities they intended to serve, right? And so given what occurred following this, right, is these affirmative action plans across the country, some voluntary and then some imposed, we examine how the threat of affirmative action litigation changed police behavior, ultimately possibly changing use of lethal force and police killings of civilians. And we focus on police killings of civilians due to the fact that the federal intervention into local policing in this case is the main goal is to improve community police relations, and with the idea that if you diversify the police, you have better interactions, right? You have a reduction in police violence and therefore reduce the likelihood of future violent demonstrations, right? Crime prevention as it relates to this policy, for at least from the federal government perspective, is a second order concern. So we follow previous work from Justin McCrary, who looked at threat of court-ordered affirmative action plans on just the racial composition of police departments. And we analyzed these cases to see if police change their behavior. And we focus on the threat of litigation, mainly due to the fact that it's likely that local municipalities change their behavior in response to the lawsuit, regardless of how it was adjudicated, right? So in a sense, you change your behavior in order to either increase the likelihood that you win or possibly reduce the penalties that you receive if you lose. So I'm going to show you outcomes related to police killings of civilians by race. And if I have time, I will show other outcomes such as changes in the racial composition of police and changes in police contact measured by arrest. And just to give you a preview of the findings, because I'm pretty sure I'll probably rush towards the end. I'll make sure we have enough time for Q&A. We find that the threat of affirmative action litigation led to a decrease in police killings of civilians. We find roughly a 40% decrease in police killings of civilians about 11 years after litigation occurs or a lawsuit is entered into federal court. If we look at what's going on over the course of our sample period, once we get to full implementation or the year 2000, this is roughly 60 deaths averted per year. We also find evidence of a decrease in police killings of white civilians, although this result is not robust to changes in regional specification checks or changes in our sample. We do identify several plausible mechanisms, one including increase in diversity, which previous research have shown that minority police officers are less likely to use force. And what's driving of the decrease in police killings of civilians is likely a decrease in police contact, as we find evidence of a decrease in non-white arrests for non-violent crimes. However, we cannot rule out that federal intervention in and of itself changed police behavior, resulting in police killings of a decrease in police killings of civilians, which I will show you an example in a case study of that shortly. So basically, our results, right, just to preview, are strong, they're robust, and it provides strong evidence that federal intervention into local policing via employment discrimination lawsuits change police behavior, resulting in a decrease in police killings of non-white civilians. So just to give you a bit of a backdrop about the environment in which integration occurred in local police departments. The first documented Black police officers are free men of color in New Orleans. They served basically between 1805 to 1820, part of the City Guard in New Orleans. And that unit was that unit ended when one of the officers, right, tried to hold a white civilian accountable to the law, right? But outside of New Orleans, blacks prior to the Civil War served in I guess you would say, some pseudo law enforcement way as it relates to slavery and slave controls in the rural South. But we really start to see blacks joining police departments. Also prior to the Civil War, is like one or two actual police departments and how we think of municipal police departments, like starting in New York and then in Boston. But in general, we start to see Black police officers after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, especially in the South, so New Orleans once again, but also in Atlanta and Nashville and other Southern cities. And then also in the North, in Chicago and Boston and New York and St. Louis, if you consider St. Louis the North. But any progress made with having Black police officers ended in the South with Jim Crow, and in the North with the introduction of the civil service exams. And so basically what we have over the next 60 to 7 years is a huge change in demographic makeup of our cities in the United States, right? We have two waves of migration of Southern Blacks to Northern and Midwestern cities, and eventually Western cities. And we had little change in the racial composition of the police department in these areas. And then also, beginning in the 1960s, the police started to have a new mandate, right? They had to deal with rising crime. This was going to occur due to the fact that you have baby boomers turning 15, 16, and 17 years old, right? And you have these new enclave of Black residents in which you are now being required to police instead of like maintaining some kind of social order, right? You're actually going in there, arresting and interacting with individuals with the goal of decreasing crime, right? And so this created a hotbed where violent clashes between the police and the Black community erupted in every major metropolitan area between 1964 and 1971 and 1972, which prompted the Kerner Commission, which I spoke of earlier, and a National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice standards which explicitly call for affirmative action in policing. And so what followed in 1969 is the most aggressive form of affirmative action and the most aggressive campaign of affirmative action in the form of court-ordered hiring quotas in police departments. We're going to focus on the place where locations where litigation occurred, but certain locations have voluntary quotas in their hiring practice. For instance, one of the strongest more aggressive affirmative action plans took place in Detroit, where they had, for every white officer on hire, they had to hire a Black police officer. Was the quota put in place? Litigation as it relates to employment discrimination was mainly brought by Black police organizations, in which they brought claims of violations of their civil rights. However, they had bigger concerns as it relates to policing in their communities. And these cases were more likely to be resolved after the Equal Employment Act of 1972, which allowed the Department of Justice to join in as plaintiffs on these cases against local governments. And so to kind of see what Black police officers, when they're suing for employment discrimination, right? Their goal is not only to diversify the police department as well as move up in ranks, but also to change policing in their communities. And so this is a statement made by Renault Robinson, who's the president of the African American Police League, which is the Black organization for police officers in Chicago. And in which he stated, we're going to elevate the Black policemen in the Black community to the same image, status enjoyed by white police officers in the white communities. And that is as a protector of the citizens and not as an oppressor, right? And then he's going to speak to like problems that we still face now with policing, right? He says that we find it impossible to operate within the framework of existing police associations. For example, we disagree with the fraternal order of police supporting stop and frisk, right, which is a big issue, especially been a big issue, at least as far as national headlines in New York. They typically get most of the attention as it relates to stop and frisk. And their position supporting the order to shoot and kill. So this speaks directly to police killings of civilians. And then, or to maim looters during civil disorders. So we had this conversation last year as it relates to protests in Washington, D.C. Right. And then he states that we will no longer permit ourselves to be relegated to the role of brutal pawns in the chess game, affecting the communities we serve. Right. We are members of this community, and wearing or being a police officer does not change this. Right. And then on the contrary, it has sharpened our perception of our responsibilities as Black males in a society seemingly unresponsive to the needs of Black people, right? And so we see our roles as the role of protectors of this community, and that is a role we intend to fill. So when affirmative action litigation is being brought against police departments, right, the goal is to fundamentally change policing in these communities, right? At least that's the goal. That these police officers have. And so we try to see if what Renat Robinson wants is occurring, at least in the data. And so to do that, we get information on police killings of civilians. And this data comes from the CDC, multiple cause of death files, which gives us information on the cause, the age and race, and county of residence of the decedent. And what's nice about this data is that it does have a code that articulates when the cause of death is due to law enforcement activity. And we're going to focus on police killings of civilians from 1959, as says here to 2016, but really to 2012. Now, I must admit, this data at any government source for police killings of civilians is going to be a severe undercount. Recent research showed that this accounts for roughly 50% of police killings, at least the government provided data. What's nice, not necessarily nice, but we can somewhat circumvent this in the sense that we're going to be looking for changes in the trend of police killings, right? So then the question becomes, what is the magnitude of that change as it relates to reporting? So here's this plot over years that overlap, right? So now we have other sources of data on police killings of civilians, like fatal encounters, mapping on the police, the counted, right? These data sets are more recent, right? While focusing on the 1960s, I only have one data set that goes that far back, as far as providing information on police killings of civilians. But in the years that they overlap, the maroon line is for the fatal encounters, which is publicly available. You can download right now. And then this is from the vital statistics, which is restricted. You have to get access to this data from the CDC. It's not hard, right? Those time series move together, but they're on the order of magnitude different. Basically, the blue line is going to be half of the maroon line, but they move in lockstep, right? So at least they're trending similarly. So to proceed, we're going to make a very strong assumption. One, we're going to assume that the underreporting is just going to influence the precision of our estimates, right? Making it more difficult for us to find an effect. But then we also have to make an assumption that is very strong. We have to assume that litigation or the threat of litigation did not change how reporting of police killings occurred, right? Or reporting behavior. And this is a strong assumption, right? We can think of many ways in which this might influence how police, the coroner's office, or medical examiners report police killings of civilians, right? So we're going to, so I should have a little bit of time. I'm going to revisit that issue, but proceed as if that's the case, that the threat of litigation does not change reporting behavior. The information that we have on affirmative action litigation comes from the main source is Justin McCrary's work, in which he documents litigation. We supplement his analysis by, or corroborate his locations by using the federal court case database that is housed at the ICPSR. It is a restricted database, but for future researchers who want to use this database, the publicly available and the restricted database is the exact same. So it can save you time with the IRB to just use the publicly available data. Doing this, his work focuses on large cities. So the assumption is that the locations that are not in this data set are not treated. This is a very strong assumption. I won't have time to go over that, but we get the same results when we limit the sample to the exact same locations in his original sample, right? So just to provide a backdrop or just kind of show descriptively what's going on here as it relates to litigation and police killings of civilians, this is going to be Cook County. And the main police department in Cook County is going to be Chicago Police Department. The black line is going to show police killings of non-white civilians per 100,000 residents. The orange line is going to show the share of new hires that are black. And as you can see, the first thing to take note of is this vertical line in 1965 is the year that the first uprising is recorded in Chicago in the 1960s. Chicago had race riots in other years prior to the 1960s. And then you can see when in 1965, when that uprising occurred, you see an immediate and sustained increase in police killings of civilians until the Black police organization AAPL brought litigation against CPD for employment discrimination in 1970, and you see an immediate decrease in police killings of civilians. And that decrease in police killings of civilians occur prior to the quota being imposed. Right. Once the quota is imposed, you see a huge increase in the share of new hires that are black. However, you don't see much change as it relates to police killings of non-white civilians, right? Providing evidence that the intervention in and of itself can change police behavior, resulting in a decrease in police killings of non-white civilians, even if the level of diversity or an adequate level of diversity is not achieved in the police department. All right, so to tackle this question, does the threat of affirmative action litigation change police behavior, resulting in changes in police killings of civilians? What we're gonna do is take advantage of the variation in the timing location when litigation occurs, right? And to kind of show you what I mean by taking advantage of the variation in a location of when litigation occurs, is this is a map of the United States, and the counties that are highlighted in different colors shows where litigation or the threat of litigation took place. Those highlighted in yellow, litigation occurred early. Those in blue, litigation occurred later after Reagan is in office. And so when I say take advantage of the location, right, we compare how police killings of civilians evolved in places where litigation occurred relative to those counties that we don't see, so they're in white, right? How does police killings of civilians evolve for those where we say it's treated or litigation occurs versus non-treated or the control group where litigation does not occur? Then the second way or dimension in which we can tease out the effect of a litigation on police killings of civilians is just focus on the counties with the different colors, right? And then we can compare the earlier treated locations, so those in yellow, to the later treated locations, those in blue, and see if we see any changes in police killings amongst the treated only sample. And I will quickly show you when we only exploit that variation. But we're going to exploit both on both dimensions initially. So we have 75 places where litigation occurs, 3,000 places that are in the control group. Many of these places that are in the control group are very small counties. So we're going to change the sample a lot to kind of see if our results hold when we make certain sample restrictions. We have a rollout over 30 to 32 years. A lot of the litigation occurs prior to the Reagan administration. It's documented that the Reagan administration kind of shrank the EEOC office during that time, in which decreased the amount of cases in which the Department of Justice joined, which may have changed actions by lawyers and individuals to bring employment discrimination cases against the police department. And what's also important to note is that although 75 counties are treated, it's a significant part of the population resides in these places. And then an even larger percentage of the non-white population resides in these places. And so the orange line, the black line shows like the percentage of the total population that resides in a county where litigation occurs. The orange line shows the percentage of the non-white population residing in a county where litigation occurs. And you can see by 1980, roughly 40% of the non-white population is residing in locations where litigation occurs. Now, what I'm going to show you as far as our results, I can show you basically with the time series, looking at police killings of civilians for those places that were highlighted in different colors versus those places that were highlighted that was in white, so not highlighted at all. So in red shows the treated places, in black shows the non-treated places or the control group. As you can see, prior to 1968 or 69, police killings of non-white civilians are increasing. After 1968, police killings of civilians is decreasing in both locations. What's important to note that police killings, there's more police killings of non-white civilians in a treated location, and the decrease is much sharper in those locations as well. In the panel on the right, I basically take the normalized difference of these two series so that the difference between the two series is 0. In 1968, the year before the first location were first litigate, the case brought to federal court. And when we do this, right, we kind of see that the pre-period, they're close together, but you still see differences. But this maps out, right, how large that decrease occurs in the treated locations. And we can kind of see basically in the time series, right, this huge decrease, which is the difference between that black and the red line on the previous page, right? And so this is just taking advantage of the variation in location, not timing, meaning the places are being litigated at different times. And so basically what I want to show you is the results. So I'm going to first show you for non-white civilians. And so an event study analysis, what is nice is that what I showed you over a calendar year, we're going to put in relative time, meaning Chicago litigation occurred in 1970. So the year before treatment is 1969. So that's year -1. But there's also other locations treated later. So a city is treated in 1980. So the year before treated is 1979. And so we compare what's going on in relative time, right? 1 year before treatment, 2 years before treatment, 3 years before treatment, right? If our model is correctly specified, right, those differences should be close to 0 because litigation hasn't occurred. And then once litigation takes place, then we should start to see differences, right, in police killings of civilians 1 year or 2 years, 5 years, 10, 15 years after treatment. And so this is kind of what I'm want to show you graphically as it relates to non-white deaths. All right. So this is going to compare everything to the year before litigation occurs. And basically what we see prior to litigation for non-white civilian deaths is that there's no change in in those treated and controlled places or litigated or unlitigated places prior to the treatment. Meaning, right, that difference that I was showing you in the time series, right, reflects what's going on in the 1960s, but places are being treated all throughout that time period in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as well as in the 90s. And controlling for that kind of handles that difference. When litigation occurs, we see an increase in police killings of civilians. It is not statistically significant under this specification, and this is a Poisson model, but eventually we start to see a decrease where point estimates become negative, and they become statistically significant. Jumped ahead too far. There we go. And so once we get to 11 years after treatment, the estimates are statistically significant and remain statistically significant up to 25 years after treatment. The point estimate in 11 years after treatment represent roughly a 40% decrease in police killings of non-white civilians relative to the pre-litigation period. So a substantial decrease in police killings of civilians. This amounts to basically, police killings are relatively rare. So this is basically one less killing every 3 years, if we think about in terms of numbers of deaths. When we look at white civilians, we don't do as well capturing the pre-treatment effects, meaning that we would like for this to oscillate around 0. That's not the case, but we do see a meaningful decrease after treatment occurs, and it remains negative. Now, this result is not robust across various specification checks, but I won't have enough time to go through those. And so basically we do a bunch of different things to check the robustness of our estimate, including using different models. But what I want to spend the last couple of minutes of my time is kind of going back to that issue of underreporting in the vital statistics data, right? Because one of the main policy levers that most, at least researchers, are recommending is just better accounting of police behavior. When is the police using force, pointing their gun, interacting with civilians? Can we get this in a systematic way that is collected in ways that we can compare across locations, right? But in my case, right, the issue with underreporting, right, in the case, it may change or be exacerbated by the treatment, or right, due to federal intervention and more oversight, they might do a better job at reporting police killings, right? So if federal intervention leads to an increase, less underreporting, then our estimates will understate the impact of affirmative action litigation, right? The affirmative action litigation where a court order hiring quota is in place also is done in general through a consent decree, and that consent decree may have other actionable items for the police department to deal with and resolve. And so you may have additional oversight. Or you could think of a scenario where police officers shirking their reporting duty in order to satisfy their consent decree, or at least show that they're doing it better, right? And if that's the case, we overstate the impact. So the first thing we do is we look to see if there's any changes in the reporting of suicides, right? Because suicides is also underreported and is dependent on cooperation between the police and county officials. And we see no systematic changes in the reporting of suicides. And then if there's underreporting of police killings of civilians, where are those counts going? Well, recent research shows that 86% of the police killings that are not accounted for in the CDC data are actually coded as homicides. And so then we look to see if there's any changes in homicides as it relates to the threat of a litigation, and we see no change in homicides for white or non-white residents. Now, that doesn't mean that there's evidence of changes or provides credence that changes in reporting behavior did not occur. The main reason why is that some of these places, there's a lot of homicides, and even in Chicago, where there's a lot of police killings, it's a small number relative to the number of homicides, and so it might be just masked and make the measurement less precise. And so one of the things that we try to do is account for the underreporting and the vital statistics by using the measurements of bias in this recent study. And when we do that, we can kind of see changes in our time series. So this is Chicago once again. And when we correct for the bias or in reporting, what basically we see police killings of civilians increase or almost double in most years. So this is for Cook County, what I showed you previously. The dashed line is the corrected measure for police killings of civilians. And so when we apply this correction, we capture an even larger decrease in police killings of non-white civilians, no change in police killings, no difference in using the correction as it relates to white civilian deaths. And that's mainly due to the fact that the authors of the previous study found that the bias in reporting is mostly related to minorities or non-white civilians. All right. So we find evidence that there's an increase in diversity after litigation occurs, which might be driving the effect. We also find evidence of a decrease in police contact that mirrors what we see in the data as it relates to police killings. And a recent paper by Emily and Weisberg shows that the racial disparities that we see in police killings and civilians stem from racial disparities in police contact. And when we look at property crime arrests of non-white civilians, we see initial increase followed by a decrease that is mostly statistically significant starting in events year 10 and 11 and remains so 25 years after treatment, providing strong evidence that changes in police contact may be driving our results. Okay. So we got roughly 15 minutes. And so I just quickly want to give time for people to ask questions, but I also want to conclude with a policy recommendation. I am a new faculty member in the Book School of Public Policy, so it is right for me to prescribe some policy recommendation based on our findings. And so we find that affirmative action litigation leads to a decrease in police killings of non-white civilians. The primary mechanisms in which we believe this is occurring is through a reduction in police contact, as we see a decrease in arrests for non-white civilians for non-violent crimes, right? And so, right, in the sense that federal interventions in local policing, at least as it relates to improving diversity in local police departments, may change police behavior, resulting in police killings of civilians, but we must be honest, right? This is a certain historical setting in which it's occurring and may not apply today. And so alternative policy recommendation is for local municipalities to adopt new technologies just to reduce police contact. And this is important due to the fact that most individuals are going to interact with police through traffic stops for the most part, right? And therefore, by decreasing interactions, you're also going to decrease police killings of civilians, okay? So that's all I have for you, and I'm open to addressing or answering any questions or comments that you may have. The first one that I see is by an anonymous attendee. And the question is, can you tell me if there are course or workshops available on this topic through Cornell for the public? That I don't know, I'm new. Figuring out Cornell as on a daily basis. I am teaching a class on economics of discrimination where we focus on some of this literature. Next spring, I don't know exactly about open to the public. I imagine through the center, right, there will be workshops available where I can present and other scholars can present their work that is especially relevant for policy and to community agencies and organizations. The second comment that I have states, Dr. Cunningham comment on Tompkins County and City of Ithaca initiative, reimagining public safety and its actions and affirmative action. I've somewhat looked at it, but I'm not as familiar as I should be in the policy. So I would love to talk offline more about some of the public safety initiatives going on in Ithaca and Tompkins County. And then I have a question by Evan. These two questions. The one it says, very interesting that Cook County, the threat of the quota was more important than the implementation of the quota. Just curious if you looked at whether this is true more generally. So yeah, so I wasn't able to show these results. So what we do as part of the paper is that we look at places where we see municipalities that got closer to closing their representation gap, meaning the demographic makeup of the police department gets close to, or some places actually is more diverse than the city or the county. Basically, what we see is that places that weren't as successful in diversifying their police department had dramatic decreases in police killings of civilians. And this is twofold. Part of this is that, so there's places treated all over the country. Most of the decrease that we are seeing is occurring actually outside of the South. In the South, where like the places that are treated are going to be more likely to achieve or do better as it relates to hiring Black police officers due to the fact that they have a large Black population. Those places we don't see as much happening. As a matter of fact, the initial increase that we see in police killings is driven by places in the South. And then the second question from Evan, in the 1970s, the racial quotas in college, in the 1970s, racial quota in college admissions were ruled to be unconstitutional. Has something similar happened in employment quotas? Yes. So Detroit had the most aggressive affirmative action plan. It actually overturned in the 1980s as being unconstitutional. After that, you see a lot of these consent decrees being overturned or redone with less stringent language, and so there is some changes in these consent decrees, and also when these consent decrees end, either due to the fact that they are deemed unconstitutional, or they just, they reach an agreement that the local municipality has met the terms of their agreement. You do see changes in hiring, resulting in less diverse police departments. And then anonymous attendee. I was wondering if this study could be applied to officers in primary and secondary schools, specifically school resource officers. That is interesting. There's some research on, right? So we know locations where have school resource officers do contribute to racial disparities in arrests. Looking at the race of those officers, I haven't seen the study there, and that might be interesting. Especially the research on that is looking at the COPS grant, which is occurring in the 1990s, where we do have some information on racial composition of police departments. However, the deployment of those officers will take like more digging in specific cities to see who's actually assigned to the schools as resource officers. And then questions, are the same results true for gender diversity for the threat of litigation? The research shows that affirmative action litigation occurs. We do see an increase in the female share of police officers. We show that in the paper. We did not, unfortunately, do the same analysis as it relates to achieving diversity or representation that we did for Black police officers, mainly because none of the police departments are going to get close to achieving 50% of their police officers of being women, but right, we can see right which police departments are more successful in hiring women and tease that out. So that is something that we should do there. And then from Kristen, says, curious about intersectionality. Do you think that litigation related to gender or increases in Black female police officers has any unique impact on police killings? We haven't tested that out. Part of the issue that we have with information on the race of officers in police department is that it's just not publicly available until at least 1987 with the Lemus data. There is information on the racial composition of police departments for municipalities in large cities in the EEO1. I always get the EEO1 and EEO4 surveys mixed up. Evan or someone in ILR can correct me. But that does have information on the demographic makeup of police departments. However, that series does not start in the 1970s, but we can, if I can get access to that data, kind of look to kind of see the intersectionalities of race and gender. I've been trying to get access to that data, and I've been told over and over again by the Department of Justice that that data should be available in some sort of research environment to deal with confidential data, but I haven't been updated on those efforts yet. And then Nancy Porter, how are your findings being introduced to policymakers? So great to know about your research. Well, we finished the paper in August, September, as we moved to, and as I moved to Ithaca. So I haven't had much public engagement with this work. I have sent it to a couple of foundations, hoping that maybe they can put the research in front of policymakers. But at least as it relates to the work on affirmative action, I haven't had much there in the policy arena. Hopefully that will change. And then an anonymous attendee, have the results changed since affirmative action has fallen out of favor? That is a follow-up paper, something that we want to look at. So we look at the long-run implications of the introduction of affirmative action litigation in police departments. As I mentioned, these consent decrees change as they are either met or ruled unconstitutional. And then so there might be changes in police behavior there that we're not picking up just due to the way that we are capturing changes in police killings of civilians, the model that we're using. So that is an interesting question. And then there's related to the question, but maybe not, right? There's a period of Black Lives Matter social movement. So basically 2013, 2014 ongoing, which is going to be a different environment in which police is interacting with civilians that might give us different outcomes as we look pre 2013. So we explicitly stopped, I mentioned this, at 2012 because we didn't want our results to run into the Black Lives Matter movement, allowing also for future work to kind of deal with, right, police community engagement, police illegitimacy, as well as, right, thinking about some of the how the policy environment is changing around things such as affirmative action. And I think that's all the questions that I see that are open.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. This was a great start to our Talks at 12 series for this semester. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you all for attending. We'll hopefully see you at in our next talk.